October 15, 2003, Vancouver Film Studios. Vincent Ashworth had humiliated actors for 30 years, made grown men cry, broken careers with a single sentence. That was his power. Jackie Chan was supposed to be different, just another actor to crush under his boot. Vincent gathered the entire crew, cinematographers, grips, extras, 200 witnesses to watch him destroy a legend.
"You're nothing but a cartoon character," Vincent screamed across the soundstage. "A joke who can't act." The silence stretched like a held breath. Jackie walked closer, looked Vincent in the eyes, and said 5 words that ended everything. Within 6 hours, Vincent's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Within 6 days, every studio in Hollywood had his name on a blacklist. Within 6 months, the truth about his stolen films hit every headline. The 5 words that killed a king. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But 6 months earlier, Vincent Ashworth had been untouchable. The Chateau Marmont's poolside bar gleamed with the kind of artificial perfection that only Hollywood money could buy. Vincent sat in his usual corner booth, the one that gave him a clear view of every table, every conversation, every deal being made without him. His fingers drummed against the mahogany surface, leaving rings from his 3rd whiskey of the afternoon. "The Chan project is our last shot," his agent Marcus wheezed into the phone, his voice carrying the desperation of a man watching his commission checks shrink. "Studios hemorrhaging money on that superhero franchise disaster. They need something guaranteed." Vincent's jaw tightened. Guaranteed. Once upon a time, his name alone had been a guarantee. Vincent Ashworth's presence had meant packed theaters, critical acclaim, and Oscar nominations. Now it meant straight-to-video, releases, and the kind of projects that younger directors passed on. Jackie's camp agreed to the meeting, Marcus continued. "They want to see the script first, but no script reading." Vincent's voice cut through the ambient chatter of industry lunches and power plays. "He shows up, or he doesn't get the part." A long pause. "Vincent, that's not how—" "That's exactly how this works. I'm Vincent fucking Ashworth. I don't audition for actors. They audition for me." He ended the call before Marcus could object, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his glass. The tremor wasn't from the alcohol, not yet. It was from the gnawing certainty that this project would either resurrect his career or bury it completely. Across the bar, 2 young executives were laughing over their artisanal cocktails. One of them glanced toward Vincent's table, whispered something to his companion, and they both smirked. Vincent caught enough of their conversation to hear "washed up" and "used to be somebody." The rage that had built his reputation flared white-hot in his chest. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile, and walked over to their table with the predatory confidence that had once made studio heads nervous. "Gentlemen," his voice carried the weight of 3 decades in the business, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about career trajectories." The younger man, barely 30 with the kind of soft features that screamed film school and daddy's money, looked up with barely concealed amusement. "Mr. Ashworth, we were just discussing the evolution of action cinema." "Evolution." Vincent smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Interesting word choice. You know what I call it? Devolution. Cookie-cutter CGI garbage made by children who think filmmaking started with computer graphics." The other executive, slightly older but equally privileged, leaned back in his chair. "With respect, sir, audiences want something different now. More sophisticated storytelling, diverse perspectives." "Sophisticated?" Vincent's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "You mean focus group to death by committee? I made films that mattered. Films that changed the industry. What have you made? PowerPoint presentations?" The silence that followed was electric with tension. Other patrons had begun to notice, conversations drifting to whispers as Hollywood's most notorious director prepared to unleash the kind of public humiliation that had become his trademark. But before Vincent could deliver the killing blow, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about David Chen. Tonight, Griffith Observatory. Come alone." The blood drained from Vincent's face. David Chen. a name he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it had never existed. The young executives noticed his sudden pallor, their smugness replaced by curiosity. "Everything all right?" the younger one asked, his tone now uncertain. Vincent pocketed his phone without responding, threw $100 bill on their table, and walked out of the chateau without another word. His mind raced as he navigated the parking garage, his hands fumbling with his car keys. David Chen was supposed to be history, a footnote erased from every credit, every memory, every conversation that mattered. The only person who knew the truth about those early films, about what really happened during the golden years that built Vincent's legend. As he drove through the Hollywood Hills, Vincent's reflection stared back at him from the rearview mirror. 58 years old, still handsome in that weathered leading man way, but with eyes that held secrets too dangerous to survive in daylight. The Chan project wasn't just about resurrection anymore, it was about survival. Because if David Chen was reaching out after 20 years of silence, it meant someone new. And in a business built on image and perception, knowledge was the most lethal weapon of all. Vincent pressed harder on the accelerator, racing toward a confrontation that would either secure his future or destroy everything he'd spent 3 decades building on borrowed brilliance. But first, he had to find out what David Chen wanted, and what it would cost to keep him quiet. Ready to see what happens when Vincent arrives at the observatory? Tomorrow's chapter reveals the conversation that set everything in motion, and you won't believe what David Chen has been doing for 20 years. Hit that follow button so you don't miss the shocking confrontation that changes everything. The Griffith Observatory loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to dreams deferred. Vincent's Porsche growled up the winding road, its headlights cutting through the November dusk as the city sprawled below in a carpet of amber lights. He'd driven this route countless times in his younger days, back when the observatory had been a refuge from studio politics and the crushing weight of other people's expectations. Now it felt like driving toward his own execution. Vincent parked in the nearly empty lot, his hands still trembling as he killed the engine. The silence pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from Los Felios Boulevard and the whisper of wind through the eucalyptus trees. He sat for a moment, studying his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back looked every one of his 58 years, the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines etched deeper by 2 decades of declining relevance, the eyes that had once commanded respect now haunted by the ghosts of choices made in desperation. The observatory's Art Deco facade glowed under the security lights, its copper dome oxidized to that distinctive green patina that reminded Vincent of old pennies and forgotten promises. He'd brought Rebecca here on their 3rd date, back in 1987, when his career was ascending like a rocket and the future stretched before them like an unwritten screenplay. She'd leaned against the telescope housing, her red hair catching the moonlight, and told him she believed in his vision. That was before David Chen, before everything went wrong. Vincent's phone buzzed again, another unknown number, but this time it was a call. He stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. "You came." The voice was older, weathered by time and whatever path David had walked for the past 20 years, but unmistakably familiar. "I wasn't sure you would. Where are you?" Vincent's voice came out rougher than intended. "East Terrace, like old times." The line went dead. Vincent sat in the growing darkness, memory flooding back unbidden. The East Terrace had been their place, his and David's, during the early days when they'd stay up until dawn plotting camera angles and dissecting the films of Kurosawa and Leone. David had been 26 then, brilliant and hungry, with an eye for composition that made Vincent's chest tight with envy, even as he claimed credit for every innovation. Vincent climbed out of the car, his Italian leather shoes crunching on the gravel. The November air carried the scent of sage and smog, that distinctly Los Angeles mixture of nature and industry that had always reminded him why he'd fallen in love with this impossible city. A security guard nodded from his station near the main entrance. Vincent's face was still recognizable enough to warrant deference, even if it no longer commanded headlines. The East Terrace was deserted except for a solitary figure standing at the railing, silhouetted against the city lights. David Chen had aged well, Vincent noted with a stab of resentment. His hair was completely gray now, pulled back in a ponytail that suggested he'd abandoned the corporate world entirely. He wore a simple black jacket and jeans, the uniform of someone who no longer cared about impressions or industry politics. "Hello, Vincent." David didn't turn around, his gaze fixed on the sprawling metropolis below. "You look good. Success agrees with you." Vincent moved to stand beside his former protege, maintaining careful distance. "What do you want?" Direct as always. David's smile was sad rather than bitter. "I heard about the Jackie Chan project. Interesting choice for a comeback." The word comeback hung in the air between them like an accusation. Vincent's jaw tightened. "My career doesn't need commentary from a ghost." A ghost. David finally turned to face him, and Vincent was startled by the peace in those dark eyes. Once they'd burned with ambition that matched Vincent's own, now they held something that looked dangerously like contentment. "I suppose that's what I am to you. What I've been for 20 years. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of children laughing from the nearby park. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called out to the darkness. Vincent found himself thinking of Rebecca again, of the home they'd shared in Malibu before the marriage collapsed under the weight of his secrets. She'd tried to understand the industry's demands, the compromises required for survival, but even she had limits. "I've been teaching," David said quietly, his words cutting through Vincent's reverie. "Film school, USC, then a small college in Oregon, helping kids learn the fundamentals of storytelling. How noble." Vincent couldn't keep the sarcasm from his voice. "It is, actually." David's tone remained steady, unruffled by Vincent's hostility. "There's something pure about it. No politics, no ego, just the craft." Vincent studied his former assistant's profile, searching for signs of the man he'd destroyed 2 decades ago, the eager young filmmaker who trusted Vincent with his dreams and his work. But that person seemed to have been replaced by someone Vincent didn't recognize, someone who looked genuinely at peace with choices that should have destroyed him. "Why now?" Vincent asked. "Why reach out after all this time?" David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the metal railing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent in exile from the industry he'd once lived for. "Because I know what desperation looks like, Vincent. And I remember what it cost the last time you felt this cornered." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing, the metal cold and unforgiving beneath his palms. Below them, the city pulsed with 10 million dreams and ambitions, most of them destined for disappointment. "You don't know anything about my situation," Vincent said, but even he could hear the hollow ring of denial in his voice. David reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, worn soft at the edges as if it had been handled countless times over the years. "I know you've been lying to everyone, including yourself, for 2 decades. I know the Jackie Chan project is your last shot before the industry writes your obituary. And I know what you're capable of when your back is against the wall." Vincent's eyes fixed on the envelope with the fascination of a man watching his own execution. "What is that?" "Insurance." David set the envelope on the stone ledge between them, his movements deliberate and careful, something I hoped I'd never have to use. The security lights cast harsh shadows across David's face, aging him beyond his years. Vincent remembered the day they'd first met. David fresh out of UCLA film school, portfolio in hand, eyes bright with the kind of naive passion that Hollywood specialized in crushing. Vincent had hired him as a second assistant, ostensibly to fetch coffee and organize equipment. But David's talent had been impossible to ignore, his instincts for visual storytelling so natural it seemed effortless. "You could have been somebody," Vincent said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "If you'd kept your mouth shut, played the game. I was somebody." David's voice carried a quiet strength that made Vincent's throat constrict. "I was the person directing your films while you took meetings and glad-handed studio executives. I was the one solving problems at 3 in the morning while you slept off another liquid lunch. You were an assistant." But Vincent's protest sounded weak even to his own ears. David opened the envelope with careful precision, removing a stack of documents and photographs. Vincent glimpsed handwritten notes in his own younger handwriting, call sheets with corrections in David's precise script, behind-the-scenes photos that showed David behind the camera while Vincent worked the crowd of producers and investors. "Terminal velocity," David said, spreading the papers like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. "Your breakthrough film. Remember the helicopter chase through downtown? The sequence that won you the Directors Guild nomination?" Vincent's mouth went dry. He remembered the sequence, remembered taking credit for it at every interview, every award ceremony, every retrospective. But the truth lived in these documents like a cancer waiting to metastasize. "You were sick that week," David continued, his voice matter-of-fact. "Food poisoning from that sushi place in Beverly Hills. I shot the entire sequence myself while you recovered in your trailer. Your assistant called in the coverage shots, managed the crew, solved the budget crisis when we went over schedule." "That's not," Vincent started, but David held up a photograph that stopped the words in his throat. It was a candid shot from the set, clearly taken by someone with access to the production. David stood behind the camera, one hand raised to direct the helicopter pilot, his face intense with concentration. In the background, Vincent could be seen talking to a reporter, his back to the action, oblivious to the magic being created without him. Neon Nights was even more collaborative, David said, producing another set of documents. "You remember that film, Vincent? Your masterpiece of urban poetry? The one that got you the 3-picture deal with Paramount?" Vincent remembered. He remembered the reviews calling his direction inspired and revolutionary. He remembered Scorsese himself congratulating him at the wrap party, praising his innovative use of practical lighting. He'd never mentioned that David had designed every shot, choreographed every camera movement, solved every technical challenge that arose during the production. "I have documentation for 5 films," David said quietly. "Scripts with my notes, photographs, testimony from crew members who remember what really happened. People who are still alive, Vincent, still working in the industry." The envelope seemed to pulse with malevolent life on the stone ledge. Vincent stared at it, understanding with perfect clarity that his entire career, every award, every accolade, every moment of professional triumph, could be reduced to ashes with a single phone call to the trade papers. "What do you want?" The question came out as barely a whisper. David looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I want you to understand what you're about to do to Jackie Chan. I want you to remember that you've destroyed careers before, Vincent. Good people who trusted you, believed in you, helped make you great. And I want you to consider whether this time, when you're standing in front of that crew ready to humiliate someone to feed your ego, it might finally be enough." The wind carried the scent of jasmine from the gardens below, sweet and cloying in the darkness. Vincent felt the foundations of his world shifting beneath his feet, 20 years of carefully constructed lies threatening to collapse in a single moment of reckoning. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Vincent stared at the envelope, his mind racing through possibilities, calculations, desperate strategies, the rational part of his brain. The part that had survived 3 decades in Hollywood's shark-infested waters began cataloging his options, deny everything, claim the documents were fabricated, launch a preemptive strike against David's credibility. "You're bluffing," Vincent said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Those crew members you mentioned? Half of them are dead. The other half wouldn't remember what they had for breakfast 20 years ago, let alone who was behind the camera on some random Tuesday." David gathered the documents back into the envelope with the same methodical care, as if Vincent's desperation was merely another item to be filed away. "You always were good at convincing yourself of comfortable lies." Vincent's phone buzzed. A text from his assistant's studios want meeting Friday to discuss Chan project. Need confirmation. The irony wasn't lost on him, his future demanding attention while his past prepared to devour it. "What's your endgame here, David?" Vincent turned away from the railing, pacing to the observatory's dome where tourists had scratched their initials into the copper cladding. "You want money? Producer credit? Your name back on those films? I don't want anything from you." The simplicity of the statement was somehow more terrifying than any demand would have been. Vincent had built his career understanding what people wanted: money, power, recognition, sex, and using those wants as leverage. But David's apparent lack of desire made him uncontrollable, unpredictable. "Everyone wants something," Vincent insisted. "That's how this business works. That's how every business works. Maybe that's why you never understood what happened between us." David's voice carried a sadness that made Vincent's chest tighten. "You always thought I was angling for something. A promotion, a piece of the profits, my name above the line. But I was just trying to make good films." Vincent's phone rang, breaking the moment. The caller ID showed Rebecca's name, his ex-wife, who rarely contacted him except for their daughter's birthday or Christmas. He let it go to voicemail, but the interruption had shifted something in the air between them. "Your family still believes in you," David observed. "They don't know, do they, about any of it? Leave them out of this. I'm not the one who put them in it." David stood, brushing dust from his jacket. "You did that the moment you decided to build a career on someone else's work." Vincent felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the white-hot fury that had powered his most memorable tirades, his legendary on-set explosions that had reduced grown men to tears. But something was different this time. The anger felt hollow, performative, like an actor playing a role he'd outgrown. "You think you can destroy me?" Vincent's voice rose despite himself. "I've survived studio politics, critical disasters, box office bombs. I've outlasted 3 generations of executives who thought they could bury me. You're nothing, David, a failed filmmaker playing teacher to wannabes who'll never work in this town." David paused in his departure, his silhouette framed against the city lights. When he turned back, his expression was almost gentle. "I'm not trying to destroy you, Vincent. You're doing that perfectly well yourself." The observation hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Vincent watched David walk away, his footsteps echoing against the observatory's concrete surfaces until they faded into the night sounds of the hills. Alone on the terrace, Vincent felt the weight of the envelope beside him, its contents more dangerous than any weapon. His phone buzzed again, another call from Rebecca. This time he answered. "Vincent?" Her voice carried the same concern that had once made him feel protected, understood. "I've been trying to reach you. Emma saw something online, some gossip site saying you were having problems with the new film." Emma, their daughter, 23 now, and working as a production assistant at a small studio in Burbank. Following in Daddy's footsteps, believing in the legend Vincent had spent decades constructing. "Everything's fine," he lied, the words automatic. "Just the usual Hollywood rumor mill." "Are you sure? You sound—" "I said I'm fine." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and Vincent could picture her in the Brentwood condo he still paid for, probably wearing the reading glasses that made her look like the literature professor she'd wanted to be before Hollywood consumed their lives. "Okay," she said finally. "But if you need anything, I don't." After she hung up, Vincent stood alone with the envelope and the city below, understanding with crystalline clarity that his attempts to stay safe had already failed. David Chen wasn't just a ghost from his past anymore. He was a harbinger of reckoning, and Vincent's carefully constructed world was beginning its inevitable collapse. Vincent didn't sleep that night. He sat in his Beverly Hills study until dawn, the envelope unopened on his desk like a loaded gun. Every time he reached for it, his hand pulled back as if the paper might burn him. Outside, sprinklers hissed across manicured lawns, maintaining the illusion of paradise in a desert city built on dreams and delusion. At 6 a.m., his landline rang. The caller ID showed a Vancouver area code, someone from the production calling earlier than any civilized person should be awake. Vincent let it ring, but the sound triggered a memory so vivid it felt like a physical blow. David's voice at dawn, on the set-off terminal velocity, exhausted but electric with creative energy, explaining how they could save the crashed helicopter sequence with 3 additional angles and some creative editing. "Just trust me on this one, Vincent," David had said, his eyes bright despite 20 straight hours of work. "I can see it, the whole sequence, how it cuts together. Give me 6 hours and a skeleton crew." Vincent had been dealing with studio executives that morning, smoothing over budget overruns and schedule delays. He'd waved David away with distracted approval, too focused on politics to care about the actual filmmaking. 6 hours later, David had delivered footage that would become the signature sequence of Vincent's career, the moment that transformed him from a competent journeyman into a visionary director. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time, Vincent answered. "Mr. Ashworth?" A young woman's voice, nervous and overly caffeinated. "This is Sarah from the production office in Vancouver. I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a situation." Vincent's blood chilled. What kind of situation? Jackie's team is asking questions about the script revisions, specifically about some of the stunt sequences. They want to know who designed them, who's going to be directing the action units. Mr. Chan's stunt coordinator is very particular about working with experienced. "I'll handle it." Vincent cut her off, his mind racing. Jackie Chan's reputation for perfectionism was legendary. If his team started digging into Vincent's actual experience with complex action choreography, they'd discover a troubling pattern. All of Vincent's most acclaimed action sequences had been shot during periods when he was mysteriously absent from set. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Someone called the office yesterday asking about archival footage from your earlier films. Said they were working on a documentary about 1980s action cinema. They mentioned terminal velocity specifically." The room seemed to tilt around Vincent. David wasn't just threatening, he was already moving, gathering ammunition for a war Vincent had thought was 20 years over. After hanging up, Vincent walked to his wall of awards, the physical manifestations of a career built on stolen brilliance. The Directors Guild Award for Terminal Velocity caught the morning light, its brass surface reflecting his haggard face. He remembered the acceptance speech, how he'd thanked his incredible team in vague, generic terms that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. David had been in the audience that night, Vincent recalled, 28 years old and still naive enough to believe that credit would eventually find its way to the deserving. He'd applauded when Vincent won, actually smiled as his mentor claimed recognition for work David had poured his soul into creating. The memory sparked others, unbidden and unwelcome. David staying until midnight to solve a lighting problem Onion nights, while Vincent entertained studio executives at Chasen's. David quietly rewriting dialogue during lunch breaks, making Vincent's stilted exposition sound natural. David covering for Vincent's increasingly frequent absences as success bred arrogance and arrogance bred carelessness. Vincent's hands shook as he opened the envelope David had left behind. Inside were photocopies, but the originals were clearly preserved somewhere safe. Call sheets showing David's handwriting in the director's notes section. Production reports documenting Vincent's absence during key sequences. Most damning of all, a memo from a long-dead studio executive praising the young man behind the camera who'd saved Neon Nights from disaster when Ashworth was having his difficulties. Difficulties. The euphemism for Vincent's cocaine problem, which had reached its peak during the production of his supposed masterpiece. While critics praised his bold artistic choices and innovative visual style, Vincent had spent most of the shoot in a pharmaceutical haze, leaving David to essentially direct the film himself. The final document made Vincent's vision blur, a handwritten note from David dated 20 years ago and never sent Vincent. It read, "I know you're scared about the studio finding out, but I've covered for you. The work is good, better than good. Maybe this is how it's supposed to be. You handle the business, I handle the art. We can make this work." The note was signed with David's characteristic optimism. Partners in crime, D. Vincent's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Emma's name. His daughter, probably calling before work to check on her father's big comeback. The daughter who'd grown up believing she was the child of a visionary, who'd chosen her own career path, based on admiration for accomplishments that belonged to someone else. Vincent stared at her name on the screen until the call went to voicemail. In the growing morning light, surrounded by awards for work he'd never done and preparing for a film he wasn't qualified to direct, Vincent finally understood the true cost of his silence. He hadn't just stolen David's career, he'd built his entire life on the theft, and now that life was about to collapse, taking everyone he loved down with him. Vincent's finger hovered over the voicemail button, Emma's name still glowing on his phone screen. 23 years of birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, family dinners where she'd asked about his films with genuine admiration. 23 years of a daughter who'd grown up believing her father was a genius. He pressed play. "Hey, Dad, it's me." Emma's voice carried the rushed energy of someone talking between tasks. "I know you're probably already on set being brilliant, but I wanted to call before my day gets crazy. There's this film professor at UCLA, David Chen. He reached out to me through the studio. Apparently he's putting together some kind of retrospective on 1980s action directors. And he specifically mentioned your work. He said he had some really interesting behind-the-scenes material about terminal velocity and wanted to interview family members about your creative process." Vincent's blood turned to ice water. I told him I'd love to participate. I mean, how cool is that? Your own daughter getting to talk about Vincent Ashworth's legendary filmmaking on camera. Anyway, he's supposed to call me later today to set something up. "I'm so excited, Dad. I've been waiting my whole career for a chance to really talk about what makes you special as a director. Love you. Kill it in Vancouver." The message ended, leaving Vincent staring at the phone like it had transformed into a venomous snake. David wasn't just threatening his career, he was targeting his family, drawing Emma into whatever revenge fantasy had been festering for 20 years. Vincent's landline rang immediately, as if David had been waiting for the voicemail to play out. This time, Vincent recognized the number, the film school in Pasadena where David taught. "Enjoying your morning, Vincent? Stay away from my daughter." Vincent's voice came out as a growl, all pretense of civility abandoned. "I haven't approached your daughter. She reached out to me after I contacted UCLA's film department about archival research. Very enthusiastic young woman, very proud of her father's legacy. What do you want?" "I want you to listen to something." There was a pause. Then the sound of David's voice changed, becoming more distant. He was playing a recording. Emma's voice filled Vincent's study. "The thing people don't understand about my dad is how collaborative he is. He always says filmmaking is about bringing out the best in everyone around you. Like, there are all these stories about him discovering talent, giving assistants real responsibilities, letting them contribute creatively when other directors would just treat them like coffee fetchers." Vincent's chest constricted. He could hear the love in his daughter's voice, the genuine pride in sharing her father's supposed generosity of spirit. That's what makes him different from all these ego-driven directors who need to control every detail. Dad understands that great films come from great teams. He's always been secure enough in his own vision to let other people shine. The recording stopped. David's voice returned to the phone, quietly devastating. "She really believes that about you, doesn't she? That you're the kind of director who lifts people up instead of destroying them." Vincent found himself unable to speak. Every word Emma had said was a dagger, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed the depth of his deception. She didn't just admire his work. She admired qualities he'd never possessed, a version of himself he'd never been. "Your daughter thinks you're generous, Vincent. Collaborative. Someone who gives credit where credit is due." David's voice carried no malice now, just a terrible sadness. "She has no idea that her hero is someone who built his entire reputation by erasing other people's contributions. She doesn't need to know." The words came out as a whisper. "Doesn't she?" For the first time, David's composure cracked. "Don't you think she deserves to understand what kind of man she's been defending? What kind of career she's been trying to emulate?" Vincent thought about Emma's production assistant job, how she stayed late to help directors solve problems, how she'd told him just last month about covering for her boss during a difficult sequence because that's what you taught me about filmmaking. It's about making everyone look good. The irony was a blade twisting in his chest. His daughter had learned Vincent's supposed lessons about generosity and collaboration, virtues he'd claimed while systematically destroying the career of someone who'd actually embodied them. 20 years, Vincent said, his voice hollow. "Why now?" "Because you're about to do it again." David's words cut through Vincent's self-pity like a scalpel. "Tomorrow you'll stand in front of that crew in Vancouver, and you'll tear Jackie Chan down to build yourself up, just like you've always done. And this time, I won't let you destroy someone else while taking credit for the wreckage." The line went dead, leaving Vincent alone with the terrible understanding that his past hadn't just caught up with him. It was about to collide head-on with the future he'd stolen from someone else, and his daughter would be there to witness the impact. Vincent's hands trembled as he set the phone down, David's final words echoing in the sudden silence of his study. The morning light had grown harsh, casting sharp shadows across the awards that now felt like evidence of crimes rather than achievements. He needed to think, to plan, to find some way to control the narrative before David destroyed everything. But first, he had to stop Emma from walking into David's trap. He dialed her number, rehearsing explanations that sounded increasingly hollow with each ring. How could he warn her away from David without revealing why? How could he protect her from the truth without admitting there was a truth to protect her from? "Dad?" Emma's voice was bright with surprise. "Shouldn't you be on set already?" "Emma, listen to me carefully. That professor who contacted you, David Chen, don't talk to him." "What? Why not?" The confusion in her voice made Vincent's chest ache. "I thought you'd be excited. It's a chance to showcase your work to academics, maybe introduce your films to a new generation." Vincent closed his eyes, searching for words that wouldn't shatter her world. "He's not who he says he is. There's history there, old politics from when I was coming up. He has his own agenda." "Dad, you're scaring me. What kind of history?" The question hung between them like a live wire. Vincent could hear Emma's keyboard clicking in the background. She was probably already researching David, pulling up his credentials, his filmography, trying to understand what could make her father sound so desperate. "Just trust me on this, sweetheart. Please, don't take the meeting." "But I already confirmed with him for this afternoon." Emma's voice had shifted, becoming smaller, more uncertain. "He seemed really knowledgeable about your work. He mentioned specific scenes from Terminal Velocity, details that only someone who really understood your vision would know." Of course, David knew the details. He'd created most of them. "Cancel it," Vincent said, hearing the edge creep into his voice despite his efforts to stay calm. "Tell him something came up. Tell him anything." "Dad, what aren't you telling me?" Emma's question carried a weight that made Vincent realize how rarely he'd heard his daughter sound truly worried about him. Disappointed, yes. Frustrated with his absences or broken promises, certainly. But not this kind of bone-deep concern. Vincent opened his mouth to lie again, to spin another story that would protect the mythology he'd spent decades building. But something in Emma's voice, the genuine fear for his well-being, made the words stick in his throat. "There are things about my career," he began, then stopped. How could he explain that everything she admired about him was borrowed from someone else? That the collaborative spirit she'd internalized, the generous mentoring style she'd tried to emulate, belonged to a man whose life Vincent had systematically destroyed? "What things?" Emma pressed. "Dad, you're really freaking me out here." Vincent's call-waiting beep interrupted, showing Vancouver's area code again. The production, probably wondering where their director was for the most important shoot of his comeback. Jackie Chan was expecting the legendary Vincent Ashworth, not a fraud who'd spent 20 years hiding behind someone else's talent. "I have to go," Vincent said, taking the coward's route. "Just, please, Emma, trust me on this. Don't talk to David Chen." "Dad, wait." Vincent switched to the Vancouver call, cutting off his daughter's protests. "Ashworth here." "Mr. Ashworth, thank God." The production coordinator's voice was tight with stress. "We need you here immediately. Jackie's team has been reviewing the stunt sequences, and they're asking very specific technical questions about the camera placement for the helicopter chase. They want to discuss it with the director before they commit to the setup." Vincent's mouth went dry. The helicopter chase was the centerpiece of the film, the sequence that would either resurrect his career or expose him as a relic who'd never understood the technical complexity of his own supposed masterpieces. "I'll be there in 3 hours," he managed. "Actually, there's been a development. Jackie's bringing in a consultant, someone with extensive experience in 1980s action choreography. Apparently, this person worked on several films from that era and specifically requested to meet with you about directorial approach." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. David. Somehow, David had inserted himself into the production, positioning himself to be there for Vincent's humiliation. the puppet master finally ready to cut the strings and watch his creation collapse in front of the industry's biggest star and a crew of witnesses. "Who is this consultant?" Vincent asked, though he already knew. "David Chen, film professor from Pasadena. Jackie's people say he has incredible insights into the golden age of practical action filmmaking." Vincent hung up without another word, his hand shaking as he set the phone aside. David hadn't just cornered him, he'd orchestrated the perfect stage for Vincent's destruction. Tomorrow, in front of Jackie Chan and a full crew, Vincent would finally face the reckoning he'd spent 20 years avoiding, and there would be nowhere left to hide. The flight to Vancouver stretched endlessly, Vincent's mind cycling between panic and rage as the plane cut through gray November skies. He'd barely slept, spending the night staring at David's documents, memorizing every damning detail while searching for some escape that didn't exist. The evidence was airtight, methodical, assembled with the same precision David had once brought to Vincent's films. The taxi from the airport wound through Vancouver's wet streets toward the sound stages, each mile bringing Vincent closer to his reckoning. He'd built his entire identity around being untouchable, the volcanic director who bent crews to his will through sheer force of personality. But that persona had always been armor protecting a hollow man, and now the armor was cracking. The soundstage buzzed with controlled chaos when Vincent arrived. Grip trucks lined the parking lot, their hydraulic arms extending like mechanical fingers against the overcast sky. Inside, the familiar symphony of pre-production filled the cavernous space, the whine of power tools, shouted instructions echoing off concrete walls, the purposeful movement of technicians building a world from blueprints and imagination. Vincent spotted Jackie Chan immediately, unmistakable even in casual clothes as he moved between departments with the fluid grace that had made him a global icon. At 50, Jackie retained the compact energy that had defined his career, but Vincent could see new lines around his eyes. The careful way he tested his movements that spoke to decades of pushing his body beyond reasonable limits. "Mr. Ashworth." Jackie's smile was genuinely warm as he approached, extending a hand that carried surprising strength. "I've been looking forward to this collaboration. Your work on terminal velocity was incredible. Those practical effects sequences were so innovative." Vincent accepted the handshake, forcing his expression into the confident mask he'd worn for decades. "Jackie, the pleasure's mine. I've been studying your choreography. Nobody understands the geometry of action like you do." It was true, which made the compliment easier to deliver. Vincent had spent years watching Jackie's films, marveling at the mathematical precision behind sequences that looked spontaneous. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was praising genuine artistry while preparing to fake his own. "Actually," Jackie said, his tone shifting slightly, "I brought in a consultant who has some fascinating insights about the period we're trying to recreate, someone who worked on several films from that era." Vincent's stomach clenched, but he maintained his smile. "Oh, David Chen. He's a film professor now, but he was active in the industry during the 80s. He has incredible technical knowledge about how those classic action sequences were really constructed." Before Vincent could respond, a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the soundstage. "Vincent." 20 years collapsed into nothing as David Chen stepped from behind a camera truck. He'd aged well, his dark hair now streaked with silver, wearing the kind of practical jacket that marked him as someone who still worked with his hands, rather than just talking about work. But his eyes held the same intelligent intensity that had once solved problems Vincent couldn't even identify. The soundstage didn't go silent. Crews kept working, equipment kept humming. But Vincent felt as though all sound had been sucked from his world. This was the moment he'd dreaded and anticipated, the confrontation he'd spent 20 years avoiding. "David," Vincent managed, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "It's been a long time." Jackie looked between them with the sharp awareness of someone accustomed to reading subtleties in human movement. "You two know each other?" "We worked together," David said simply. "Long time ago." The understatement hung in the air like smoke. Vincent could see crew members glancing over, sensing the tension without understanding its source. In the entertainment industry, past conflicts were common enough, But something about David's quiet intensity and Vincent's rigid posture suggested this was deeper than typical professional disagreement. David was just explaining some of the technical challenges of the helicopter sequence, Jackie continued, apparently deciding to push through whatever undercurrent he'd sensed. He has some interesting ideas about camera placement. Vincent forced himself to focus on Jackie's words, but his attention kept drifting to David's face. There was no malice there, no triumph, just a patient sadness that was somehow worse than anger would have been. Perhaps, David said, his voice carrying across the space with quiet authority, Vincent could walk us through his directorial approach, show us how he plans to capture the essence of those classic 80s sequences. It was beautifully done, Vincent realized. David wasn't attacking or accusing, he was simply creating space for Vincent to reveal his own limitations. In front of Jackie Chan and a full crew, Vincent would have to demonstrate expertise he'd never possessed, direct sequences he'd never really understood. The trap was sprung, elegant and inescapable, and as Vincent looked into David's patient eyes, he understood that his former assistant had become something far more dangerous than an enemy. He'd become a mirror. Vincent stared into that mirror for what felt like an eternity, the soundstage bustling around them, while time crystallized into this single moment of reckoning. 20 years of lies pressed against his chest like a physical weight, and suddenly he was exhausted by the effort of holding them up. "I can't," he said quietly. The words escaped before he could stop them, barely audible above the ambient noise of construction and preparation. But Jackie heard, his expression shifting from polite interest to concern. "Vincent?" David's voice carried no triumph, only a gentle patience that somehow made everything worse. Vincent looked around the sound stage, at the crew members building sets with their calloused hands, at the technicians solving real problems with tangible solutions, at Jackie Chan, whose entire career had been built on the authenticity of his own physical commitment. These were people who created something from nothing, who earned their reputations through actual skill and dedication. "I said I can't." Vincent's voice grew stronger, clearer. "I can't walk you through my directorial approach, because it was never mine to begin with." The admission hung in the air like a confession at an altar. Jackie's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't speak. David remained perfectly still, waiting. 20 years ago, Vincent continued, his voice gaining momentum, as the dam finally cracked, David was my assistant director. Except he wasn't just an assistant, he was the vision behind every sequence you admired, every innovation you praised. I was the face, the name, the one who took credit. But the work, the real work, belonged to him. The words tumbled out now, each one a small relief and a fresh wound. Vincent found himself looking directly at Jackie as he spoke, needing to see the moment when admiration curdled into disappointment. "I destroyed his career to protect my secret, made sure he could never work again, never tell anyone what really happened. I let the industry think he was unstable, unreliable. I stole 20 years of his life to preserve a lie." Jackie's face remained carefully neutral, but Vincent caught the slight shift in his posture, the way a man adjusts when he realizes he's been standing next to a stranger all along. David finally spoke, his voice soft with something that might have been compassion. "Vincent." Though, Vincent turned to face his former assistant fully. "You wanted me to look in the mirror? Fine, I'm looking. I see a man who built an entire identity on someone else's talent, who convinced himself that taking credit was the same as earning it, who was so terrified of being exposed as ordinary that he destroyed an extraordinary person to keep the secret." The sound stage had grown quieter around them, though Vincent couldn't tell if crews had actually stopped working or if his confession had simply created its own pocket of silence. "The helicopter sequence you want to discuss?" Vincent continued, looking back at Jackie. "David designed it. The camera movements, the practical effects integration, the way we captured motion without losing character, all David. I was just the one who stood behind the monitor and nodded like I understood what was happening." Jackie absorbed this information with the same focused attention he brought to studying fight choreography. "Why tell us this now?" Vincent considered the question, surprised to find the answer was simple. "Because I'm tired of being afraid, and because you deserve to work with someone who actually knows what they're doing." He pulled the folder from his jacket, David's careful documentation of their shared history, and handed it to Jackie. "This is proof if you need it. Contracts, memos, behind-the-scenes footage David kept. Evidence of who really created the films that made my reputation. Jackie accepted the folder, but didn't open it. Instead, he studied Vincent's face with those intelligent eyes that had assessed countless opponents and collaborators. "What do you want me to do with this?" Jackie asked. The question caught Vincent off guard. He'd expected immediate termination, industry blacklisting, the swift justice he'd probably deserved for 2 decades. Instead, Jackie seemed to be offering him a choice about his own destruction. Vincent looked at David, seeing something in his old friend's expression that he'd missed before. Not vengeance or vindication, but a kind of patient hope, as if David had orchestrated this confrontation not to destroy Vincent, but to finally free them both from the weight of their shared past. "I want you to give him the career he should have had," Vincent said finally. "David should be directing this film, not consulting on it, not advising from the sidelines, actually directing it. And I want everyone to know why." The admission left Vincent feeling strangely light, as if he'd been holding his breath for 20 years and could finally exhale. He'd spent so long armoring himself against this moment that he'd never imagined how liberating the truth might be. For the first time since David had reappeared in his life, Vincent felt something approaching peace.